Today we're going to be talking about the uncanny. This fall marks the 100th anniversary of Freud's essay Das Unheimliche, published in 1919 in Imago magazine. So why are we talking about the uncanny? What is the uncanny? As I said, the German word for it is unheimlich. Heimlich means or refers back to the home. So unheimlich, unhomely. We can also think of the English words familiar and unfamiliar. Familiar obviously has to do with family, the home. And as we'll see in Freud, in the first part of his essay, he talks about he gives kind of a semantic analysis of Heimlich and unheimlich, but some other words for uncanny or inexplicable strangeness. That's a phrase I think I got from Webster's Third. The disturbingly familiar, the unfamiliar, eerie, what is beyond normal, what is abnormal, the aesthetics of anxiety. And that's a Freudian term, and so is the unintentional return, which we'll get to later. Mystery, weirdness, spookiness, but it's not just scary or mysterious or bizarre or frightening. It has to do with all of these things, but it's not quite any of them. It's as Freud says, it's a species of the frightening. It's a type that you'll encounter, and in fact, it's not like a theme or a genre or anything. It's an experience that the reader or the viewer, feels, and so it's different for everybody. Some people find certain experiences uncanny, other people don't find them uncanny, and we'll see in Freud's essay why that may or may not be so for you. I think it's really useful for understanding the uncanny to go over the plot of The Sandman, and there are many different examples of the uncanny. In fact, the word uncanny I think is used like 3 or 4 times throughout the story, so it's kind of self-consciously uncanny. So Jensch decided to kind of focus on the automaton aspect, the idea of not being able to recognize something as real or unreal, as a human or a robot, the state of intellectual uncertainty, of doubt, ambivalence, ambiguity, and that being tied up with the automaton. Freud, on the other hand, wanted to focus on the figure of the Sandman and the motif of eyes, losing one's eyes and ocular devices as the main kind of thrust of the uncanny in the Sandman. So let me just go over kind of the plot synopsis of the Sandman. It starts with a letter from the main character, the protagonist Nathaniel, to Lothar. This is the brother of his fiancée and his long-time friend, because Clara and Lothar stayed with his family when he was growing up, like as a teenager, because they were left orphaned by a distant relative, and so Nathaniel's family took them in. Anyway, so he's writing this letter to Lothar, and already we're in the epistolary format, like Bram Stoker's Dracula, where you have letters and a verisimilitude. This, idea, it's not a fairy tale. This is like found letters. This is a real story, or based on a real story. So, the reason he's writing to Lothar is because recently, a barometer seller named Coppola comes to his apartment where he's studying at university, and offering to sell his wares. Nathaniel gets freaked out, threatens to throw him down the stairs, and they would read by themselves, sometimes they would play parlor games, but every night at 9 o'clock, the mother would say, it's time for bed, the Sandman is coming. And every night, when she said that the Sandman was coming, Nathaniel could hear steps coming, through the front door, and coming up the steps, he could hear these slow, hollow, croaking steps. And so one day he asked his mother, who's the Sandman who's coming, who's chasing us away from Papa? And the mother says, oh, the Sandman isn't real, it just means that you're tired, and it's as if the Sandman threw sand into your eyes. Then Nathaniel asks the nurse, do you know who the Sandman is? And she tells him that the Sandman is a wicked man who comes to visit the homes of naughty children, and he throws sand in their eyes, which causes their eyes to leap out of their sockets, and he takes the eyes to feed them to his beak-shaped children in the crescent moon. So, obviously freaks Nathaniel out. He's scared and obsessed for years and years and years, and he just keeps drawing and obsessing over the Sandman figure. So one day, really, not quite convinced of either. He knows the Sandman is, the steps coming up the stairs, but he doesn't really believe that it's the fairy tale version. He wants to find out who the Sandman really is. So he hides in his father's study one night, past 9 o'clock, when the Sandman comes in, and the Sandman enters. But it turns out to be his father's friend and colleague, Coppelius, and the footnotes say that the Coppelius comes from the Italian coppo, meaning eye sockets. And Coppelius is this figure described, really sinister looking, this long ponytail, just really big, hairy hands, and creepy laugh, and no one liked him except for the father. The father either, owed him something or looked up to him, kind of idolized the guy, and called him master. When Nathaniel's spying on them, they start to conduct these alchemical experiments. This cupboard opens up, a fireplace appears, and then they start to do all these experiments. And Nathaniel is watching this whole time. It gets dark, it gets scary, and Coppelius says, it's time to bring the eyes, bring the eyes. He's 10 years old. He leaps out from his hiding place. Coppelius says, little beast, what are you doing? But then he says, oh, look, now we've got a fine pair of children's eyes. And then the father, he says, master, please spare my son's eyes. And Coppelius says, oh, yeah, all right, but let's examine the mechanism of his hands and feet, or arms and legs. And he starts dislocating, the limbs of Nathaniel. And at this point, it's hard to tell if this is a memory or a dream or a combination. But then he wakes up and he sees his mother standing over him and asks, is the Sandman there? Is the Sandman there? And the mother says, no, the Sandman is long, long gone. So at this point, Coppelius disappears, vanishes for a while. He ghosts the family for about a year. And Nathaniel returns to normal and he regains his sanity. But then about a year later, when the clock strikes 9, Nathaniel and the family can hear footsteps coming up the stairs. That's Coppelius, the mother says. And the father admits, yes, that's Coppelius, but this is the last time he's going to visit me. And it's take the children up to bed, go to sleep. This is the last time he'll visit, don't worry. So she takes the children to bed, and a couple hours pass, and around midnight, Nathaniel can't sleep. He's just sitting in bed with his eyes wide open, freaking out. At around midnight, there's this huge explosion like a cannonball, and everyone rushes to the study, and Nathaniel and the family see the Coppola at his apartment, and he's almost positive that it's Coppelius. It looks like Coppelius. He has the same scary, crooked features. And he ends the letter by saying that he's determined to avenge his father's death. So, Clara gets this letter by mistake, and Clara's letter to Nathaniel basically says, this is all in your mind. This is all part of your unconscious in a way. All, childhood fears, and it's understandable, but, the only power that these malevolent forces have is the power that you give to them, the power of your belief. And so Nathaniel, it wavers back and forth. There's doubt in Nathaniel's mind between, whether it's all in his mind, as Clara says, or if the Sandman is out to get him, and Coppelius is Coppola, is the Sandman, and he's out to get him. He explains that he no longer believes that Coppola is Coppelius. He's just pretty sure that they're not the same person anymore, so he's starting to calm down. He then describes a newly arrived physics professor, Spallanzani, and when he's going to the lecture hall one day, he peeks into this room, which he thought was a window at first, because there was always kind of a drape covering it, but the drape was open and he could look through, and he could look through into a room where he saw a beautiful, shapely woman named Olympia. It's Spallanzani's daughter, and he's kind of transfixed for a moment, but he's also kind of freaked out because he describes her as asleep with her eyes open. Spallanzani keeps her locked up, apparently, and he concludes the letter by saying that they'll see Clara and Lothar in a couple weeks. The rest of the story is told by the author. So the author, the narrator, interjects himself after the third letter, kind of taking over from here on out, but saying, isn't this a crazy story? Real life is stranger than fiction. I learned of this story from my friend Lothar, and so he admits to adding color to the story to make it, more interesting and poetic and heighten certain effects. But, that nothing can be stranger or weirder than real life, and that the poet can do no more than capture the strangeness of reality. And we'll talk a little bit how Freud talks about the uncanny in fiction versus reality. The rest of the story goes as follows. So Nathaniel and Clara, they get back together, and they just start arguing over kind of differences in philosophical opinion. He never felt like listened to or understood, and neither did she. His annoyance with Clara's cold, prosaic temperament increased, while Clara could not overcome her irritation with Nathaniel's dismal, obscure, tedious mysticism, and so they became increasingly estranged from one another. Nathaniel then spends like 3 manic days writing this poem in this frenzy of inspired activity, and it's all about Coppelius destroying her, destroying his loving relationship with Clara. And they're at the altar about to get married. Coppelius shows up, touches Clara's eyes. The eyes leap out into Nathaniel's chest and burn him, and Coppelius throws him into this fire, and Clara kind of wakes him up and saying, "Look, no, Nathaniel, I've got my eyes. Look, I have my eyes." And Nathaniel, the tumult ends, and he looks into Clara's eyes, but what looks back at him from Clara's kindly eyes is death. When Nathaniel reads the poem to Clara, Clara says, how crazy and insane the poem homeless, and he yells at her, saying, "You accursed automaton." They get into a big fight. Lothar hears the fight, and he comes to Clara's rescue. Lothar and Nathaniel start fighting. They agree to a duel, and then Clara hears that they're going to duel and breaks it up, and Nathaniel ends up sobbing and begging for forgiveness, and that's how he leaves Clara and Lothar. They kind of pledge their undying love to each other, and then he leaves for university for his final year, before which he'll return to his hometown. And so he goes back to his university to discover that his house had burnt to the ground. He ends up taking his fellow students and whoever else, saved all of his stuff, and he was able to move into a new house right across the street from Professor Spallanzani, remember, with his daughter Olympia. And from his window he could look into Olympia's room and view her sitting. She's normally just sitting there motionless in front of her vanity, but all of her features are indistinct, and his vision isn't that great. So one day he's in his room writing a letter to Clara, and there's a knock at the door, and it's Coppola selling his stuff again. And he says, "Oh, I have beautiful Isa to sell you. I have beautiful Isa." And Nathaniel freaks out. He's like, "What are you talking about, you madman?" And he brings out a bunch of spectacles onto the table. They're just glasses. And they all start shimmering into, Nathaniel's eyes. He's overcome by mad terror. And seeing the reaction, Coppola takes all the spectacles and all of the glasses and puts it back into his pocket. He says, "Oh, no good for you. Well, maybe beautiful glassa. And he brings out spyglasses, large and small spyglasses. And Nathaniel involuntarily picks up a spyglass and starts peering into Olympia's room. And here he can see all of her features very distinctly, and he's just mesmerized by her beauty. And so he buys the spyglass off of Coppola for 3 ducats, and he can hear Coppola laughing as he's leaving down the stairs. So he's always fighting with this, this dark is this a dark malevolent force, or is this, just my mind? He rationalizes the laugh by saying, "Oh, it's because I overpaid." So, Nathaniel and his spyglass have a good time, just staring into Olympia's room and admiring her beauty. He becomes obsessed with her. He doesn't think of Clara anymore. It's just Olympia. And one day his classmate Sigmund tells Nathaniel that Spallanzani is going to have this ball, this big party. It's kind of like a coming out debutante ball for his daughter Olympia. Obviously, Nathaniel's really excited. They go to the party. He really wants to dance with her. So, when the dance is started, he goes up to Olympia and asks for a dance, and they start dancing. But the peculiar rhythmic regularity with which Olympia danced often disconcerted him and made him realize how badly he kept time. So Olympia's, she also sings at this ball. Her singing and her dancing are very rhythmic and mechanical. So, not everyone is convinced that she's a normal human being. And the ball ends, he goes home, and Sigmund, his fellow student, tells him that, she would be beautiful, but that her eyes seem to have no ray of life. They seem almost to lack the power of sight. Her gait is curiously measured, as though her every movement were produced by some mechanism like clockwork. She plays and sings with the disagreeably perfect soulless timing of a machine, and she dances similarly. Olympia gave us a very weird feeling. This is the uncanny. And we wanted nothing to do with her. We felt that she was only pretending to be a living being, and that there was something very strange about her. So, the uncanny was an effect that was produced at this ball, because it seems like a lot of them were very suspicious of Olympia. They may not have been completely convinced, oh, she's an automaton, we know this. So that's why they had a repulsed reaction to Olympia and didn't want anything to do with her. Nathaniel thinks that, he just doesn't understand her, that she's just too complex and just too deep and just beyond normal human beings, and so they just don't understand, her or Nathaniel. Nathaniel sees himself reflected back in her, perhaps because he feels like a machine, like he doesn't really have free will, like everything is being controlled by some higher power, some higher force. So Nathaniel is so in love with Olympia that he forgets all about Clara and goes to propose to her. And as he's ascending the stairs, he notices a fight. There's two men fighting over this human figure, and they're manhandling her. And it turns out that it's Coppola and Spallanzani fighting over Olympia. When Nathaniel realizes it's Olympia, he runs in. Spallanzani is screaming, "This is my life's work. This is 20 years of my life." Coppola is saying, "It's my eyes. It's my clockwork." And Coppola is a lot stronger than both of them and ends up throwing the body of Olympia over his shoulder and running down the stairs. Spallanzani is on the ground. He says, "But that's my best automaton. Go fetch Olympia, go save her. Here are her eyes." And he throws the bloody eyes that are on the ground into Nathaniel's chest, mirroring the poem that he composed earlier. And he lunges at the professor and grabs him by the throat. And at this point, the whole neighborhood started rushing in because they could hear the huge commotion. And they try to, get Nathaniel off of the professor. And, he's just not having it. And he's thrusting about, and no one can overcome him. They end up tying him up and taking him to an insane asylum, a madhouse. The town realizes that Olympia was this automaton. There's this huge fuss. Coppola left town and he's nowhere to be seen. Olympia vanishes as well. The whole town is freaked out by the story of Spallanzani's automaton. And it made such a deep impression in their minds that they began to question all of the humans around them, thinking that, oh, maybe I fell in love with a lifeless wooden doll, starting to demand complex thoughtful sentences from their lovers. So Spallanzani disappears because he's under criminal investigation for defrauding the public with his automatons, and Coppola disappears, presumably with Olympia in tow. Nathaniel, again, it's kind of like this time when Coppelius leaves for a year. Nathaniel starts to recover. He seems to be cured. He gets back together with Clara. They have some good fortune because this miserly old uncle died and left them an estate and some money, so they're all going to move up to the mountains. And so, before they move to their new estate, the four of them, Nathaniel, his mother, Clara, and Lothar, are all shopping in the town square. And Clara sees this large tower looming over them and says, wouldn't it be a good idea to go up there and get one last view of the area before we leave? Nathaniel's mother decides to go home. Lothar doesn't want to climb all the steps, so he stays at the ground level. And Nathaniel and Clara the two lovers climb the steps the spyglass mechanically, involuntarily, and glances over and looks at Clara, and for some reason this sparks, madness in him. And he screams, "Spin, wooden dolly. Spin, wooden dolly." And he seizes Clara and is about to throw her over the edge of the tower, the parapet. And Lothar can hear this commotion, and he's running up the stairs while she's screaming in terror and clutching onto the railings. And Lothar eventually makes it up, and she has one hand on the railing, and Nathaniel is trying to throw her over the edge, and Lothar comes in, grabs his sister, punches Nathaniel, takes his sister down the stairs and saves her. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's still up in the tower, spinning around, screaming "Fiery circle spin, fiery circle spin," which is a line from his poem that he wrote. And meanwhile, the whole market square, the whole town is they're beginning to go up the steps to try to seize the lunatic. And Coppelius is there in the crowd, and he laughs, "Ha ha, just wait, he'll soon come down himself." And Nathaniel, up in the tower, looks down and sees Coppelius and screams, "Beautiful Isa, beautiful Isa," and jumps off of the tower to his death below. And so that's the end of the story. Nathaniel's body is splayed on the pavement, his head is shattered. Coppelius flees town again. He's never to be heard from again. And it ends with just a short paragraph about Clara being seen holding hands with an affectionate husband and 2 little kids running around. So presumably she found domestic happiness. And it's just a really crazy story with lots of instances of the uncanny. We have the doubling effect that takes place when little Nathaniel spies on his father and Coppelius doing their alchemical experiments and fighting over his eyes. And then you have the same thing happening with the automaton Olympia, the 2 characters, Spallanzani being, a father figure, and Coppola as a stand-in for Coppelius fighting over Olympia and her eyes. And throughout we get this sense that Nathaniel sees himself reflected in Olympia because he feels he's kind of under the constraints of a higher power, of a dark power that's controlling him. And there's, all these descriptions of kind of involuntary and mechanistic movements that he makes, reaching for the spyglass, not knowing why, writing the poem and not knowing why, not knowing whose hideous voice it is. And you have the doubling effect with the poem and what happens at the end of the story. So I've been reading The Sandman from this collection, The Golden Pot and Other Tales. The introduction again highlights the uncertainty about the borders of reality and opening up explanatory avenues that were later explored in Freud's The Uncanny. So, highly recommend this. I've read 2 other stories in this collection, and Hoffman's a fantastic writer, and it's amazing that he was writing over 200 years ago. So that was a long-winded plot synopsis of The Sandman, but I do think it's kind of important to go over all, the main plot points, because it's interesting to see what Freud chooses to focus on and what he chooses to ignore. So, after hearing the story of The Sandman, you can see why Freud would be so interested in it. It starts, the main protagonist has this traumatic experience in his childhood that keeps recurring and returning in his adult life. So Freud was interested in the uncanny because it has to do with the unconscious. And he didn't invent the idea of the unconscious or anything, but that was certainly the kind of central focus of his work, of his psychoanalytic work. He points out that the prefix "un" is a mark of repression, so it's no wonder that the prefix is shared in uncanny and unconscious. He sees this all relating back to the unconscious, and the idea of the unconscious is basically that everything that happens to you in your life, every event, is imprinted like an etch-a-sketch that has been erased, but all the traces still remain somewhere, deep within, and particularly traumatic events get repressed more, get hidden more, and so the repressions come back. So let's talk about Freud's The Uncanny. The version that I'm working with, the translation that I'm working with, is the Penguin edition, translated by David McClintock. And I love the cover. We can talk about the cover later. And the introduction is by Hugh Hoffman. So let's talk about Freud's essay. It's broken up into 3 parts. The first part is basically just a list of definitions. It serves as an introduction. He defines Heimlich and Unheimlich using a lot of different examples, and he kind of gives a semantic analysis talking about how the meaning of the uncanny, what uncanny is evident in the word itself, because the word Heimlich turns into or shades into its opposite. So Heimlich means the home, but it can also kind of turn into the uncanny. The home is filled with secrets, it's filled with pain and memories and things you want to keep hidden. He doesn't do this, but we can do a similar thing with the English words canny and uncanny and familiar and unfamiliar. He then talks about the 2 definitions of Unheimlich. Not exactly meaning opposite. We can take, for example, the undead. It's not dead, which would mean alive. So the undead is not the same thing as alive. So it doesn't quite mean its opposite, but it does signify a negation of the first. So Unheimlich would just add "un" to all of the dictionary definitions. Unhomely, unfamiliar, untame, meaning weird, eerie, uncomfortable. Unheimlich, the second definition, which is the less commonly used definition, would mean unconcealed, unsecret, what is made known, what is brought out into the open, so that it connects with the second definition of canny, which is secret, hidden, concealed. So this second definition of the Unheimlich would be unconcealed, taking what should have remained hidden and bringing it out into the open. I'll just read a little bit. There are thus 2 courses open to us. Either we can investigate the semantic content that has accrued to the German word Unheimlich, of which the nearest semantic equivalents in English are uncanny and eerie, but which etymologically corresponds to unhomely as the language has developed, or we can assemble whatever it is about persons and things, sense impressions, experiences, and situations that evokes in us a sense of the uncanny, and then go on to infer its hidden nature from what all these have in common. I can say in advance that both these courses lead to the same conclusion, that the uncanny is that species of the frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar. So Freud ties the uncanny effect back to his ideas of the Oedipus complex, of childhood repressions, and of repressions of the individual and of the race. And so those are the 2 main reasons for the uncanny, either a return of the repression of the individual, such as, a traumatic childhood, or the return of the repressed of the race, which is these old primitive ideas of souls and animism and gods and demonic forces and all of the old beliefs that that modern man has since, what he calls, surmounted. Not exactly completely, erased. It's still there. It's still lurking in the background, like the unconscious, like childhood, and it's imprinted on the mind from previous generations. So when people say, "Oh, my ancestors are with me," or they get the sense that they've lived past lives and whatnot, that's all kind of it's bound up with this idea of a return of the repressed things that are the unconscious, which is there but not there. Same thing with the uncanny. It's at home. It's homely, but it's also unhomely, the unconscious being the same kind of thing. But clearly he wants to tie everything down to his psychoanalytic theory, which you can see is maybe his attempt to provide a theory of everything, and if it cannot apply to literature and to art, then it may not be, a true relevant theory. He writes, "Any remaining doubt vanishes once one has learned the details of the castration complex from analyses of neurotic patients and realized what an immense part it plays in their mental life." So the castration complex basically presents itself in girls as penis envy or desire for the penis, which can be kind of like a stand-in for power or, an active attitude, and it presents itself in boys as a fear of losing that penis, losing that power, losing the potency and active attitude. So he even uses the uncanny effect of automatons, not knowing if they're real or fake, and living dolls as an example that harkens back to childhood wishes and drives. In this case, in the case of automatons, from not an infantile fear, like an infantile fear of losing your penis, but an infantile wish or desire to have their dolls come to life, because children are fond of treating their dolls as if they were alive. So the uncanny effect of an automaton can reach back into that childhood wish or drive for animism, for the idea of for their dolls to come alive. Freud then discusses the idea of the double. He refers back to Otto Rank's essay, "The Double or the Doppelganger," which refers to this idea of a split or self-divided ego. And for Freud, the main split is between the conscious ego and the unconscious, the repressed unconscious, linking the double back to ideas of mirror images, shadows, guardian spirits, the doctrine of the soul, and the fear of death. So Freud connects this idea of the double back to primitive stages of our mental development, of the individual, of childhood, and of the race, when we did believe in souls and an afterlife, and a lot of us still do to this day, but modern man has surmounted such beliefs, so when they come back to us, they don't come back, the double doesn't come back as like a comforting thing that, where it may have been back in early days, where, totems and different ideas of doubling and gods and this, idea of animism, where that might be comforting. The double now becomes an object of terror, and it's frightening to us. He connects the idea of doubles back to, Coppelius and Coppola being doubles of one another. The father and Coppelius being doubles of one another. One Spallanzani, which is the professor. Remember the scene where Spallanzani and Coppola are fighting over the eyes of the automaton. This reflects the childhood incident where his father and Coppelius were fighting over his eyeballs. So it's like basically the same scene doubled. The doubling of what he writes in the poem and what happens in real life. So Freud writes about how repetition is not experienced all the time as something uncanny, but in his experience under certain conditions, it is felt as uncanny. For instance, he describes this memory of leaving a piazza in a small Italian town, and he wanders around for a while, and then he comes back to the same piazza from a different location, and that was an uncanny experience for him. It was this idea of the unintentional return and this sense of helplessness and maybe a higher power, destiny bringing him back to the same spot. All of a sudden, amongst the unfamiliar, you're walking through streets and blocks that you don't recognize. It's a foreign land, and then all of a sudden you're back at the place that you originally came from, where you don't expect it to be. This idea of repetition, where you don't expect it to be. He thought he was far away from the piazza, and all of a sudden it returns. He recognizes it. It's familiar, but it shouldn't be there. So then Freud talks about encountering the same number over and over again, in this case the number 62, such as receiving the ticket number 62 for your coat when you see a play, for instance. And he talks about repetitive numbers kind of being a message or a signal, a message from beyond. In this case, a premonition of his own death. And this compulsion to repeat can lend a sort of demonic quality to things, and a robotic automaton-like quality to things. If you see someone repeating the same phrases, or even in the story Nathaniel maybe feels this unconscious need to play out the poem that he wrote, and he doesn't recognize who wrote it, but this compulsion to repeat what was in the poem. Same thing with the compulsion to repeat a childhood trauma, perhaps. Seeing things reflected from the past to the future, and we can even recognize this idea of repetition signaling signaling a fate or a destiny. The idea that everything has already been written down in the book, and we're just acting out someone else's story, someone's story who wrote it for us, and we have no free will, and we have no real control over our lives and our destinies. And so that all has an uncanny aspect to it. If you start to think, I'm just playing a role. I am just acting out the part. After discussing the evil eye, Freud refers to a term that was suggested to him by a patient of his called the omnipotence of thoughts, and he ties this back to old, superannuated, primitive, discarded beliefs of a past period in our evolution. And the omnipotence of thoughts refers to like telepathy, magical powers of thought, being able to think something and then have it manifest in reality. For instance, he uses the example of wishing someone dead, and then the next day they die. That harks back to this kind of primitive belief in magical powers, and that can be perceived as uncanny. So Freud links this primitive animistic phase of human development to the idea of something that was long familiar to the psyche, but has since been repressed, and now it's coming back to haunt you, or coming back in different manifestations of the uncanny. Freud then mentions other forms of the uncanny, such as death, dead bodies, spirits, and ghosts, even pointing out that the German word for haunted house is unheimlich Haus. So it can, it kind of refers to anything that's haunting, that's ghostly. And Freud links this back to these old primitive ideas of an afterlife, of souls, of animism. So having discussed all of that, the repression of the individual, the repression of the race, animism, the evil eye, the omnipotence of thoughts, unintended repetition, the compulsion to repeat, and the castration complex, which is tied in with this larger Oedipus complex, Freud feels as though he's covered, most of the factors that turn the frightening into the uncanny, though he admits it's not exhaustive, and there can be a lot more discussion when it comes to what makes something uncanny. So at the end of part 2, he ends with saying how the uncanny effect often arises when the boundaries between fiction and reality are blurred, which goes back to Jentsch's original theory and explanation of intellectual uncertainty. So this idea of uncertainty keeps coming back to haunt him, even though he's trying to pin it down. He acts as if he's self-assured, but then this creeping doubt keeps coming in. At the last paragraph of part 2 talks about the uncanniness of female genitalia, tying it back to the ultimate return home. I knew this place before. I've been here before. So, part 3. This is his conclusion, basically. And he goes over a lot of the same things that he mentioned previously. A lot of it is a return to these old themes, these old motifs. But Freud begins by recognizing that everything that reminds us of repressed desires or fears or drives, or even the old discarded beliefs of bygone eras, that this won't necessarily create an uncanny effect. There's something missing there. So after, talking about the return of the repressed of the individual and of the race, he then says, but there's something else there, obviously. That's not all there is to it. So again, this creeping doubt about what he's doing. He then points out how uncanny examples in fairy tales, like Hans Christian Andersen, but we can think of Disney films, like Toy Story or Cars, as not being uncanny, because we've already accepted this fantasy world where basically anything can happen. And so these don't present themselves as something, very uncomfortably strange. In order for the uncanny to exist, there has to be a pretense to reality. You kind of have to believe that you're operating within the confines of the real world. And then he goes on to compare the difference between uncanny in real life and the uncanny in fiction. And that real life comprises far fewer instances, because fiction is able to produce basically whatever it wants and create these illusions of reality, of free will. The old ones live on in us, on the lookout for confirmation. So then Freud discusses the uncanny in fiction and how it's much richer than anything we can experience in real life, talking about, embracing something that is lacking in real life, and now something that's uncanny in real life is not necessarily uncanny in fiction. For instance, a disembodied hand in real life is certainly uncanny, but in fiction, like let's say the Addams Family, that's not uncanny. We've already accepted that we're in this fictional world. So then he talks about kind of how the uncanny can only really be produced by fiction if it promises reality, if it makes a pretense to reality, and then it goes beyond it, and that puts us into this realm of the fantastic, or the uncanny, where we have a uncertainty about what's real and what's not. So this is how he ends the essay. He kind of says, oh, there's this, and this, but we've kind of reached the end. As for solitude, silence, and darkness, all we can say is that these are factors connected with an infantile anxiety, something that most of us will never wholly overcome. Psychoanalytic research has dealt elsewhere with the problem of such anxiety. I find this essay really interesting because it kind of shows Freud's anxiety about his own ideas and his own research. At least that's the way I kind of read it. He presents himself as being confident in his opinions about the Oedipus complex and castration anxiety, but he's always introducing doubt, and he doesn't really know. And I see his desire to see clearly and to pinpoint the truth and to tie things down to, oh, this is a representation of that, and I can understand the mystery of the universe, or the mystery of humans, basically. And he's afraid of losing his eyesight. He's afraid of losing his power to see all this. Because the Hoffman story, the Sandman story, reads uncannily like a Freudian case history. We have early childhood trauma. We have the family, the mother, the father, the son. We have the early death of the father. We have constant recurrence of childhood fantasies and childhood drives and dreams into the present day. And it goes hand in hand with Freud's ideas about seeing and failing to see, about repression and return of repression in later life, about dreams and fantasies, the real and the artificial, the psychological and the supernatural. Freud's The Uncanny is an exploration into unexplored territory, in fact, into the world and the realm of the unexplored and the unfamiliar itself. And like Nathaniel, Freud is afraid of losing his sight. He's afraid of losing control. Despite attempts to cast the idea of intellectual uncertainty to the side, he keeps returning to it. He keeps returning to this idea of uncertainty and doubt, as if haunted by the uncertainty of his whole psychoanalytic theory, perhaps his whole theory, the Oedipus theory. Perhaps he's haunted by this uncanny sense of maybe it's not true. What's the line between fantasy and reality? So Freud is similarly put in a state of unease or discomfort. Freud sees himself in Nathaniel, the way Nathaniel sees himself in Olympia, and we're constantly told that Nathaniel goes through these kind of mechanical motions, this compulsion to repeat, and perhaps Freud is also compelled to repeat this theory of the Oedipus complex. So Nathaniel ends up falling in love with and seeing himself in the automaton Olympia, just as Nathaniel takes Olympia to be real and to be true and real. Freud takes Nathaniel to be true and real, and so believes his account of things. And as we've mentioned, both are extremely fearful of losing their sight, of losing their eyes, and their ability to see. The ability to see what's true, what's real, what's right in front of their eyes. And this constant hang-up about perhaps it's wrong, perhaps I'm not seeing things correctly. The unconscious itself is unexplored, unknowable, psychic content, and that's what Freud's trying to bring out. He's trying to bring out the unconscious so that we can see it and recognize it and respond to it and understand it. But like the uncanny, the unconscious is is the amygdala, or amygdalae. We have two. It's a part of the brain that is deep within the temporal lobes. It's near, the center of our brain, close to the brain stem, where it releases hormones like glucocorticoids that get sent throughout our body that help activate the stress response system. So the amygdala actually receives and responds to sensory information before the conscious thinking part of our brain, like the prefrontal cortex, can intervene and think about it and make sense of it. So this is actually, connects fairly well with the idea of the unconscious, the more, instinctual, deeper parts of our brain, and these things we have some control over, but it's mostly unconscious and mostly out of our control. It just happens. So it makes sense that Freud would link the uncanny back to primitive thinking, or an earlier stage of human development. That part of the brain is what gets activated way before our conscious or later, more modern part of the brain gets activated. There is a lot of psychoanalytic nonsense out there, but on the other hand, we keep coming back to him. He talked about a lot. He wrote about a lot of different things. He was on a lot of cocaine, and he said some pretty insightful things about the unconscious that we're just starting to kind of realize with modern neuroscience. Obviously, it's not, neuroscience is not going to confirm an Oedipus complex, but it does confirm the idea of the unconscious. Not that that was Freud's original idea, but he had a lot to say about depression, melancholia, grief, jokes, dreams, the uncanny, things that we are still discussing today. And if he was so just loony and out there and nothing he said was of any relevance to understanding our modern world, or understanding, our own selves, then we wouldn't be discussing him that much. So we have this ambivalence between what is safe and what is dangerous, what is awesome and awful, what is terrible and what is terrific, and there's this constant it kind of goes along with the connection between pain and pleasure. A lot of these neural connections are kind of intertwined, and certain behaviors, certain tics, certain symptoms are manifestations of repressions. So it's kind of like up to the psychoanalyst to uncover these repressions, like what's behind these habits and behaviors of yours. And the idea is that once you discover the repression, it's no longer repressed and you're cured. Psychoanalysis was a type of therapy, or is a type of therapy, referred to as the talking cure. When you discover, what's lurking behind what's at the root of your issues and your relationship problems and this and that. It's known. It's brought into light, and so it's no longer repressed. And I guess, you might repeat the same behaviors, but you'll know why, and maybe by fixing the repression and addressing the repression, better behaviors will follow. So for Freud, traumatic events are like violent intrusions that get buried deep within a person's psyche, and there's something that's like radically unexpected and something that they cannot integrate into their reality, into their psychic reality. So the more traumatic something is, the more repressed it gets. And for Freud and Lacan, external shocks or uncanny experiences kind of owe their effect to touching upon this pre-existing psychic content that then gets brought back to the fore, but in a way that you don't recognize. For Freud, intellectual uncertainty or ambivalence, undecidability is certainly a factor in the uncanny, but for him it has more to do with this repressed unconscious content, such as, the death drive, the pleasure principle, castration anxiety, penis envy. All of this would be As we can probably see by now, the horror genre is intimately connected with notions of the uncanny, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of filmmakers, like Jordan Peele, have read the uncanny and have studied the uncanny. If you're a writer or filmmaker, I highly recommend reading the essay and reading different theories and different notions of the uncanny in order to produce the effect in your art, which goes back to the Russian formalist Shklovsky's idea that art should seek to estrange and to make the familiar unfamiliar, to look at things anew, to look at things for the first time. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to go over 13 unlucky forms that the uncanny can take, which I'm borrowing from this textbook, if you call it that, An Introduction to Literature, Criticism and Theory by Andrew Bennett and Nicholas Royal. And it's a really good book. I highly recommend it if you want just a general introduction to literary criticism, literary analysis, and comparative literature. There are chapters on things like the uncanny, which is where I'm getting this list from. So the first thing that he lists is repetition, writing. Two obvious examples of the uncanny would be déjà vu and the idea of the double or doppelganger. And so this idea of déjà vu is a feeling that you've seen or experienced something before, almost in a past life or in a dream. It's just too familiar to the point of making you uneasy. And there's that French term, déjà vu. There's also another French term, jamais vu, which is seeing something for the first time. It's like the opposite of déjà vu. It's related to Capgras delusion, which is a real thing that happens to people, and it causes a lot of distress in their families because they'll see someone like their wife or their mother, but since the visual part of the brain that recognizes this person as familiar, as you still recognize it as your wife or mother, but it's not connected. The part of the brain is not connected to the emotional part of the brain that activates the sense, the warm sensation of familiarity. So since there's not that connection there, the brain sort of rationalizes the idea of like, I can recognize it, but it's not that warm, nice feeling that should be there. They must be an imposter. They must be pretending to be my wife or pretending to be my mother or father. And some specific examples of repetition are the constant recurrence of the same thing over and over again, such as repeating numbers, as Freud refers to in the uncanny, talking about the number 62 and that number holding personal significance to him because he thought that that was a sort of marker of his own death, a premonition of his own death. And he wrote the uncanny when he was 62. Other examples of repetition include the double. Freud remarks on the paradox of the double being a sort of promise or marker of immortality, in the sense that, oh, there's my double, I can be duplicated, as in a clone or something. I can be copied forever, I can live on forever. But also the idea of death as well. Oh, look, that's me. And questioning your own identity, and if I'm over there, am I not here? I must be, dying or about to die. Something like that. We can also think of déjà vu, which the Oxford English Dictionary defines as both an illusory feeling of having previously experienced a present situation, a form of paramnesia, and also the correct impression that something has been previously experienced before, tedious familiarity. And this can sort of tie back to maybe a recurrence of a childhood memory, of a repressed desire, of a repressed drive from childhood, We can also think of déjà vu's opposite, jamais vu, which is French for never seen, and it is the sensation of recognizing something as familiar but it feeling new and like you're encountering it for the first time anyway. So this happens too when we repeat the same word over and over again. The word eventually becomes unfamiliar to us, even though we recognize it. And there's actually a neurological disorder, called Capgras delusion, which is when, like, you'll see your wife or your mother, and you'll recognize her, as always, but if you don't have the neural connections between the visual cortex that recognizes the person and the emotional connection that you associate with warmth or love or something that connects you to that person, then you might rationalize, oh, well, I'm not feeling this warm emotional connection. They must be an imposter. And this is a real thing. You might think that this is a pretty significant or dramatic rationalization. Oh, they're an imposter, thinking, it's either a doppelganger or a robot or something. But the brain really hates any kind of discrepancies, as we've seen. It doesn't like cognitive dissonance, so it will come up with the best reasoning that it has available to it in order to eliminate that discrepancy. So interestingly, with Capgras delusional patients, this effect only applies to vision. So if they see their mother come in, they'll have that sensation of, oh, my mother's an imposter. But upon hearing her voice over the phone or something, they don't get that feeling, which basically tells you that we have different neural pathways for vision and for auditory information and for visual information. So before we knew about the brain and the anatomy of what was going on, you might give this would be a prime opportunity for a Freudian analysis. For instance, the idea of repressed desires and the repressed desire for your mother. Your mother comes in, there might be some sort of neurobiological piece missing that actively represses those desires. So when you see your mother, you have a sexual desire for your mother. You rationalize that away by saying she's an imposter because you don't want to have incestuous sexual feelings towards your mother. So that can't be my mother. That would probably be the Freudian analysis. But now we know that it's semi-related, but there's that missing connection between the visual cortex and the amygdala that processes the images that we see. We can see the idea of doubling and duplication in something like Jorge Luis Borges' book, short story, Borges and I, in which the last line is very uncanny. He writes, "I do not know which of us has written this page." So the second form the uncanny can take is odd coincidences, and this can sort of tie into repetition, such as the reoccurrence of the same number over and over again. It's this idea that either there's some sort of higher force sending you a message, trying to tell you something, whether it's God or whatever else it may be, maybe a darker force trying to send you a message. So Freud writes that it is only the factor of unintended repetition, odd coincidences, that transforms what would otherwise seem quite harmless into something uncanny and forces us to entertain the idea of the fateful and the inescapable when we should normally speak of chance. The third uncanny form is animism, which is basically this belief that everything in the universe has a life force. It comes from the Latin word anima, which means life force, and it's basically giving the inanimate life or spirit. sun, moon, everything in the universe has a spirit behind it, and in this worldview, there's no real clear definitions, but boundaries between the natural and the supernatural. There's this one plane of existence where, yeah, things may appear ordinary, but then beneath the surface there's this underlying sacred reality. Thinking of animism in the context of the uncanny reminds me of Peter Weir's cinematic adaptation of Joan Lindsay's mystery novel, Picnic at Hanging Rock. And basically, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's kind of a mix of mystery, horror, art house film. It's beautiful and it has this faded aspect to it, but basically it's the story of these girls that go out on a picnic on Valentine's Day in the year 1900 in Australia to a volcanic formation. It's like a really beautiful mountain near Mount Macedon. And so I think 3 of the girls and the teacher go missing, and under very mysterious circumstances, and by the end you don't know what happened, and there's all these allusions to a darker force, or perhaps the spirit of the mountain took them. Anyway, it's a great mystery. Makes me think of animism and the uncanny, and you can definitely see different instances of the uncanny in the movie. I highly recommend it. So the next uncanny form is anthropomorphism, and this is a specific instance of animism where a human shape or form is given to an inanimate object. The next uncanny form that we have is radical uncertainty about sexual identity, and here we can think about the uncanniness of gender in general. The idea of, is it male or female? Is it both? Is it female when it's, does it seem like a female when it's in fact male? And this kind of reminds us of Schelling's definition of the uncanny as all of that should have remained hidden. So this idea of immodesty, or making people feel uncomfortable. We talked about cognitive dissonance, and holding 2 different ideas or beliefs at the same time is uncomfortable, and perhaps to relieve that sense of discomfort in others, we conform to our gender roles. So we can walk through life and deal with life easier. And the idea of the androgyne, or the hermaphrodite, or the intersex, intergender individual. This is gestured to by the very word and the very coupling of Heimlich and unheimlich. It means like both things at once, and it's that tension that causes the uncanny effect. The next uncanny form that we have is fear of being buried alive. As an example, Bennett and Royal provide Poe's The Premature Burial. It's a story about a guy who is afraid of being buried alive, so he designs the family crypt in order to be able to escape from. And it reminds me of this Lore episode, the podcast Lore. I think there was a story of some woman getting buried alive, and her sister or some family member having a dream that she was in fact alive in her coffin, and they went to dig up the coffin. She convinced everyone to dig it up and exhume the body, but she was already dead. However, there were fingernail scratchings on the inside of the coffin. The inside of the lining was all torn, and her the fingers were all ripped to shreds and everything. The fear of being buried alive was so real that they used to create all these different mechanisms, such as a bell system, so that people, if they woke up, they could ring the bell and alert the gravekeeper to dig them up. And some people will tell you that the origin of the phrase "saved by the bell" goes back to these mechanisms that were installed into coffins back in the day. But I think it's actually a boxing term. I'm not exactly sure. The reason why the fear of being buried alive is an uncanny form is because it blurs the line and the boundary between being alive and dead. It's life and death and life, and that ambiguity and that tension is the cause of an uncanny feeling, an uncanny sensation. Number 8 is silence. Freud mentions silence in the essay, but remains curiously silent on the subject, only mentioning it in passing. Bennett and Royal, in their list of the 13 uncanny forms, they quote from Turn of the Screw in this section for silence. And Turn of the Screw is a ghost story that is really uncanny and fantastic, and it's up to the reader to decide if this is a ghost story and the ghosts are in fact real, or they're figments of the governess's imagination. There is a strangely silent encounter on the stairs between the governess and the dead Peter Quinn. It was the dead silence of our long gaze at such close quarters that gave the whole horror, huge as it was, its only note of the unnatural. If I had met a murderer in such a place and at such an hour, we still at least would have spoken. Something would have passed in life between us. If nothing had passed, one of us would have moved. The moment was so prolonged that it would have taken but little more to make me doubt if even I were alive. I can't express what followed it, save by saying that the silence itself became the element into which I saw the figure disappear. Number 9, telepathy. So this is the idea of having alien, foreign thoughts in your head that aren't your own, being inhabited by an other, maybe by a double. This reminds me of a line from the Sandman, where he's finished writing the poem, and he says, "Whose demon voice is this?" And he gets pretty freaked out, but then, starts to calm down a little bit, but wondering where it came from. It's this idea, and I'm sure you've experienced it, like, where are these thoughts coming from? I'm not making them. I don't know who it is. I don't know what it is, but I'm not in control of these thoughts. It's as if some alien guests are knocking at your door, and they come in and they take over the whole house, and you've lost control. 10 is death. Death is something that's both familiar, we've all experienced it around us, but unfamiliar. Nobody has experienced it themselves. There are, people who claim that, they died and came back to life, but then they're not dead. We have so many ideas about what happens to us after we die, but again, they're all effectively guesses. It's at the heart of nearly all of our fears, but it's also something that we desire as the ultimate liberation, as purification. Suicide is something like the 7th leading cause of death in the United States. You may know that the majority, about 2/3 of all gun deaths in the United States, are suicides. So, there's definitely something to this. Freud, I believe, ties it back to this kind of pre-existent quiescence, a peaceful position of nothingness in the womb, and a desire to go back, a desire to return to the womb, or the tomb. So, number 11 on our list is the death drive, and this refers to the Freudian idea elucidated in the 1920 essay, a year after the uncanny, called Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where he talks about death drives and connects it to the compulsion to repeat and a repetition as a way to get over childhood traumas and as a way to deal with these different drives and wishes and fears in our life. It's interesting, though, text of the Sandman, Nathaniel seems to be driven towards death. He has a close encounter with death when he's a child. He writes the poem talking about Coppelius or Coppola throwing him into the fire and dying that way. This fear of losing one's eyes and losing one's body and life to the Sandman, and ultimately throws himself off of the tower and kills himself. So it's interesting that maybe this was lurking in the back of Freud's mind as he was analyzing the story, but he never really mentioned this aspect of the story, the death drive of Nathaniel and his attraction towards living out, fulfilling this dark destiny that he feels he's been given. Number 12, we're almost done with the list. Number 12 is ghosts. Again, this ties back to death, it ties back to doubles, but this can the ghost figure can be seen almost as the quintessential figure of the uncanny, blurring all distinctions between life and death, the real and the unreal, inside and outside, whether things are occurring in real life and you're actually being haunted by a spirit or a ghost, or whether this is all in your mind. Going back to Nathaniel's delusions trying to be explained by Clara as figments of his imagination. Same thing with Turn of the Screw, where we have the governess not knowing if the ghosts are real or not. And this connects to Freud's idea of the return of the repressed, the return of these archaic, surmounted, primitive thoughts of afterlife, of different religious beliefs, spirits, animism, that there are other worlds, other realms out there that cannot be examined by science. It's beyond reality, beyond science. The ghost embodies the return of what should have remained hidden, maybe the skeletons in the closet that are coming back to haunt you. This repetition or this recurrence of the past is something that is deeply uncanny. So number 13, our final uncanny form, is language, which is an appropriate way to end this because, as we learned in Freud, there are many more examples of the uncanny in fiction than there are in real life. And we can see the uncanny as being a product of these different plays with language. The uncanny is a perception. The uncanny is a perception and a feeling as much as it is an effect, a mode of writing or of creation. So if you're interested in creating uncanny effects and sensations in your audience, definitely read Freud, definitely read whatever you can about the uncanny. And all the time you have creators, writers, artists tell you that their inspiration strikes them like a bolt of lightning, seems to come out of nowhere, comes to them in dreams and other forms of the unconscious. So there's this idea that there's this foreign body working with some foreign mind, some foreign influence that we're only privy to maybe in our most unconscious mindsets. But this idea that there's a double or triple or quadruple within us, and we're fighting with it to create. There's something weird or spooky about a muse, about inspiration. As Nathaniel says after he writes his poem, whose hideous voice is this? He doesn't recognize the voice. It seems to come from elsewhere. Joseph Conrad, who wrote The Heart of Darkness and The Secret Sharer, once referred to writing as wrestling with a dumb devil for every line of creation. E.L. Doctorow wrote, writing is a socially acceptable form of schizophrenia. Hearing voices, feeling like you're just the messenger. This idea, again, goes back to the uncanny figure of doubles, of shadows, of mirror images, of alien influences, of foreign forces. Remember that Freud told us that fiction and literature has a lot more opportunity for creating uncanny effects than real life presents. He writes, "The writer can intensify and multiply this effect for beyond what is feasible in normal experience. In his stories, he can make things happen that one would never or only rarely experience in real life. He promises reality and then goes beyond it, and that's something that fiction and art can do. It can tap into this other realm of existence that gives us a lot more opportunity for creating uncanny effects." So it's actually like a production of language. It's something that movies and literature can create that otherwise wouldn't have been there or would never present themselves to us in real life. Again, it goes back to this Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky's idea of defamiliarization or estrangement, the Russian word ostranение, and it is this idea of presenting things that we're familiar with in a new way to make us think about them differently, and that's a major function of art, to make strange or to defamiliarize our accustomed perceptions, our everyday reality. And like Hoffman does in The Sandman, by making a pretense to reality, by making a claim to reality, you're much more able to play with the idea of the real and the unreal and produce these uncanny effects. And that's why the uncanny can only really be found in a story that makes a pretense to reality, needs to promise us reality and then go beyond it. Otherwise, we are completely immersed in this fantasy of like a Toy Story or a fairy tale, and something speaking or something outlandish happening isn't uncanny. We've already taken this, we've already suspended our belief and expect the unexpected. It's when you don't expect it that the uncanny can really take hold. And if you do want to read a very interesting and rigorous analysis of the uncanny and the return of the repressed in terms of horror films, there's this essay by Robin Wood called An Introduction to the American Horror Film. And here he uses kind of like Marxian, Freudian ideas to analyze horror films as representations of the repressed, and like jokes or dreams or literature, fantastic literature, horror films have this ability to represent our society's repressions and our individual repressions to us in the form of monsters and ghosts and haunted houses. And you can think of horror, its main theme almost always seems to be the family and the home, and making the family unfamiliar and making the home unhomely. I hope you've enjoyed this quite lengthy discussion of the uncanny and that you'll join me next time. I'm hoping to make more of these videos, maybe 1 to 3 a month, and discussing different texts, and mostly for myself so I can remember what I've read and what I've thought about, but also I hope it helps other people and that other people can enjoy it as well. So everything that I've discussed, and even things that I haven't discussed that I think are relevant, I'm going to add to the description below so you can go on your own exploratory journey into the unknown. And I hope you join me next time. This is Bottom Books. My name is Daniel, and have a wonderful, uncanny night.